Somewhere in a cave in the mountains of northern Spain, two men were buried approximately 7,000 years ago. They were young, both in their early 30s. They had been placed carefully in the cave, alongside ornaments made from the teeth of deer. They had lived full lives in a world that, to any modern eye, would have been unrecognizable. They hunted red deer and wild boar through forests of birch and pine. They fished salmon from cold rivers. They knew the landscape around them with an intimacy that no settled farmer could match. Every game trail, every berry thicket, every seasonal migration route of every animal they depended on. Their people had been living this way in Europe for over 40,000 years. In 2006, archaeologists found their remains. In 2014, scientists extracted and sequenced the DNA from one of their teeth, the first fully sequenced genome of a pre-agricultural European ever produced. What the genome revealed shocked the researchers who read it. These men looked nothing like the way we imagine ancient Europeans. They had dark skin, carrying the African versions of the pigmentation genes that give modern Europeans their pale complexion. Those genes had not yet arrived in Europe, but their eyes were blue, a mutation that had already spread through the hunter-gatherer populations of the continent thousands of years before farming began. Dark skin, blue eyes, a combination that exists almost nowhere in the world today. These were the original Europeans, the people who had inherited the continent after the last ice age, who had walked its forests for 40,000 years, who had developed languages and cultures and spiritual practices of which we know almost nothing. Within a few centuries of when these two men were buried, their entire way of life, and almost their entire genetic lineage, would be gone. Not because of climate change, not because of plague, not because of any environmental catastrophe anyone could point to, because farmers arrived from Anatolia, and what followed was the most complete population replacement in the prehistoric history of our species. This is the story that ancient DNA has only recently allowed us to read. The story written in the genomes of bones from caves and burial pits across Europe. The story of a people who lived here for 40,000 years and were replaced so thoroughly, so completely, that for most of human history nobody even knew they had existed. The first genocide nobody remembers. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to understand what was there. The Western hunter-gatherers, the scientific term for the people who inhabited Europe from roughly 40,000 years ago until the arrival of farming around 7,000 years ago, were not primitive cave-dwelling brutes. They were the product of 40,000 years of accumulated human knowledge, adapted over countless generations to the specific ecology of the European continent. They knew which plants were edible at which times of year, which animals to hunt and which to leave, how to read weather and water and the behavior of prey. They made tools of flint with a precision that required years of practice to master. They made ornaments from shell, tooth, and bone. They buried their dead with care and ceremony. They almost certainly had complex spoken languages, oral traditions, cosmologies, and systems of social organization, none of which left direct archaeological traces, and all of which were lost so completely when their world ended that we have not a single word of them. Their physical appearance, reconstructed from ancient DNA studies of dozens of individuals across Europe, was strikingly different from modern Europeans. They had dark skin, a direct inheritance from the African origins of all modern humans, not yet altered by the selection pressures that would later favor lighter pigmentation in farming populations living on a diet lower in vitamin D. But they had light eyes, blue or green in many cases, a mutation that had spread through the population thousands of years before. Farming arrived, possibly through sexual selection, possibly through random drift in the relatively small and isolated populations of Ice Age Europe. The Cheddar Man, Britain's oldest near-complete human skeleton, dated to approximately 10,000 years ago, whose DNA was sequenced in 2018, had dark to black skin and blue eyes. So did the La Branya individuals from Spain. So did hunter-gatherers sequenced from Hungary, Luxembourg, and across the breadth of Europe. This was not an unusual combination. It was the standard appearance of the people who owned Europe before farming arrived. The image we carry in our heads of ancient Europeans, pale, blonde, blue-eyed, is actually a description of people who arrived later. The original Europeans were something else entirely. Their population was small. Europe at the height of the Mesolithic period, the final stage of the hunter-gatherer era, roughly 10,000 to 7,000 years ago, probably held no more than a few 100,000 people, possibly as few as 100,000. The continent was vast, the forest dense, the game plentiful, and the human footprint light. Communities were mobile, following game and season, forming complex social networks across wide territories. They were not isolated. There is evidence of long-distance trade and contact between groups separated by hundreds of miles. But they were few. And being few, they were vulnerable in ways they could not have understood. Because somewhere to the southeast, a different kind of human society had been building for thousands of years, and it was about to arrive. Around 10,000 years ago, in the region of modern Turkey and the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, something happened that would change the trajectory of human civilization irreversibly. Human beings began to farm. The shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture was not a single invention or a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of practices, the deliberate cultivation of wild grasses, the selective breeding of animals, the construction of permanent settlements, the storage of surplus food, that over thousands of years transformed the relationship between human beings and their environment in ways that had no precedent in the history of our species. Farming was, in almost every measurable short-term respect, worse for the individual human being than hunting and gathering. Farmers worked longer hours. They ate a less diverse and less nutritious diet. They were more vulnerable to famine when crops failed. They lived in denser settlements that spread disease far more efficiently than the mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. The skeletal evidence is unambiguous. The first European farmers were shorter than the hunter-gatherers they replaced, had worse teeth, worse bones, more infectious disease, and shorter average lifespans. But farming had one overwhelming advantage that rendered all of these individual disadvantages irrelevant at the population level. It produced more food per unit of land, much more. A piece of land under cultivation could support 5 to 10 times as many people as the same piece of land under hunter-gatherer management. And more people meant more farmers, and more farmers meant more land under cultivation. The logic was self-reinforcing and essentially unstoppable once it began. By 7000 BCE, the farming populations of Anatolia had been multiplying for thousands of years, and the pressure of population on the available land had reached a point where expansion was not optional. It was the only alternative to starvation. They expanded west, into the Balkans, into the Danube Valley, into the Mediterranean coastline, into Central Europe, following the rivers, the coastlines, the routes of least resistance through a continent that was inhabited, but not densely, not in ways that could effectively resist a population that was reproducing faster than anything the hunter-gatherers had ever encountered. The genetic evidence is extraordinary in its clarity. In the Balkans, the first point of entry for the Anatolian farmers, the hunter-gatherer gene pool was replaced by approximately 98%. 2%. That is what remained of the people who had lived there before. In Central Europe, the replacement was nearly as complete. The linear band-ceramic culture, the first farming culture of Central Europe, which expanded rapidly along the Danube Valley starting around 5500 BCE, shows overwhelming Anatolian genetic ancestry with minimal hunter-gatherer admixture. Region after region, as the ancient DNA studies have been conducted, the pattern is the same. Anatolian farmers arrive, and within a few generations, the hunter-gatherer genetic signal collapses. But here is the detail that the viewer's comment identified, and that makes the story far more disturbing than simple demographic replacement. The replacement was not equal between the sexes. The Y chromosome, the male genetic lineage, shows near total replacement. The haplogroups that had characterized European hunter-gatherer males for tens of thousands of years essentially vanished from the population within a few thousand years of farming's arrival. The mitochondrial DNA, the female lineage, shows substantially more continuity. Hunter-gatherer female lineages persisted at significantly higher rates than the male ones. The women survived, the men did not. The asymmetry between male and female genetic survival is one of the most disturbing findings in the entire field of ancient DNA research. It is a pattern that, when it appears in historical context, has a clear and well-documented cause: violent conquest, in which the males of the defeated population are killed and the females are absorbed into the victorious population. But the prehistoric record cannot give us certainty. The genetic pattern is consistent with violent replacement. It is also consistent with a subtler process: demographic competition, in which farming populations outcompeted hunter-gatherer populations reproductively, and the specific dynamics of that competition happened to reduce male hunter-gatherer fitness more severely than female. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. They may both be true in different proportions in different places and different times. What the archaeological record can tell us is this: the Neolithic transition in Europe was not peaceful. The mass graves tell the story most directly. At Talheim in Germany, dated to approximately 5000 BCE, a pit containing the remains of 34 people was discovered, men, women, and children, showing signs of systematic violent death, their skulls crushed by stone axes. Analysis of the skeletal remains revealed something specific. The local women were missing. The grave contained men and children from the local community, but the women of reproductive age were absent. They had not been killed, they had been taken. The researchers concluded that the attack had been carried out specifically to capture women, that the men of the community had been massacred, and the women removed as captives or wives by the attacking group. At Schoneck-Kilienstatten in Germany, dated to between 5200 and 4800 BCE, a mass grave containing the remains of at least 26 individuals was found. The skulls showed lethal blows. More than half of the shin bones had been deliberately broken, a pattern the researchers interpreted as either post-mortem mutilation or an effort to prevent the wounded from escaping. Among the dead were children as young as 6 months old. Again, the young women of reproductive age were absent from the grave. Again, the conclusion was the same. The attack had been designed to kill the men, kill the children, and take the women. A third mass grave at Aspern-Schletz in Austria, contemporary with the other two, showed the same pattern. Bioarchaeologists have now cataloged skeletal trauma evidence from over 2,300 individuals at 180 sites across northwestern Europe, dating to between 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. More than 1 in 10 showed weapon injuries. In some regions and periods, the evidence points to organized, repeated, systematic intergroup violence on a scale that begins to look less like individual conflict and more like warfare. The pattern that emerges, when you combine the genetic evidence of male lineage replacement with the archaeological evidence of mass violence and the specific absence of young women from massacre sites, is one that has a name in the historical record. When one population systematically kills the males of another and takes their females, it is not simply demographic competition, it is conquest. It is the specific form of violence that the male Y chromosome replacement pattern, appearing again and again across the ancient European genome studies, quietly records. This does not mean that every encounter between farmers and hunter-gatherers was violent. The ancient DNA also records genuine mixing, regions and periods where the two populations coexisted and interbred over generations. The pattern was not uniform. It was not a single event, but a process that unfolded across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, with enormous regional variation. Some hunter-gatherer communities were absorbed, some were displaced, some were apparently massacred. The overall genetic outcome, the near-total replacement of the male lineage, the substantial but incomplete replacement of the female lineage, is the aggregate result of all of these encounters, played out across a continent over millennia. But the aggregate result is what it is. The men of the original Europe are gone. Their Y chromosomes, which had been present in Europe for 40,000 years, are no longer there. The women who carried their mitochondrial lineages survived in larger numbers, absorbed into the farming communities that replaced the world their ancestors had built. The most important thing to understand about the replacement of Europe's hunter-gatherers is that it did not require deliberate extermination to produce the outcome we see in the genetic record. The economic logic of farming versus hunting was, by itself, sufficient to produce population replacement over a long enough time frame, even without a single deliberate act of violence. Farming populations could sustain population densities 5 to 10 times higher than hunter-gatherer populations on the same land. This meant that a farming community and a hunter-gatherer community competing for the same territory were not competing on equal terms. The farmers could always field more people. They could absorb casualties that would be catastrophic for the hunters. They could recover from setbacks that would destroy a smaller group entirely. And they were always, in every generation, putting more people into the competition for land, food, and survival than the hunters could possibly match. The hunter-gatherers also faced a specific economic problem that the farmers did not. Their entire way of life depended on the availability of wild game and wild plants across large territories. The moment those territories began to be cleared and cultivated, the ecological foundation of the hunter-gatherer economy was destroyed. A forest cleared for wheat fields is not just a piece of land that hunters can no longer use. It is a destruction of the entire ecosystem that sustained them. The game trails, the berry patches, the salmon runs, the seasonal abundance that their culture had spent 40,000 years learning to exploit. Every acre of forest cleared by farmers was an acre of the hunter-gatherer world that ceased to exist. The farmers did not need to kill all the hunter-gatherers to destroy them. They only needed to farm. The deforestation, the cultivation, the construction of permanent settlements, the domestication of the animals that competed with wild game for resources, all of it systematically dismantled the ecological infrastructure that the hunter-gatherer economy depended on. The hunters retreated as the farming frontier advanced, pushed into less productive land, into the marginal zones at the edges of the continent, where the soil was poorer and the game thinner. And as their resource base shrank, their population shrank with it. This is why the replacement was so complete. It was not a single war. It was a structural economic competition between two fundamentally incompatible modes of producing food, played out over thousands of years across an entire continent, in which one mode of production was so demographically superior that the other had no long-term survival strategy. The hunter-gatherers of Europe were not defeated by an army. They were outcompeted by an economy. The violence, the mass graves, the broken shin bones, the missing women accelerated the process. It was the visible, brutal face of a replacement that was already happening through demographic pressure alone. But the violence was not the cause. The cause was the farm. The hunter-gatherers of Europe left almost nothing behind that we can read. No writing. Writing would not be invented for another 3,000 years after their world ended. No monumental architecture. Their structures were of wood and hide, long since decayed. No art, with isolated exceptions in cave paintings from earlier periods that may or may not represent their specific cultural tradition. The languages they spoke are gone without a trace. The stories they told, the beliefs they held, the names they gave to the rivers and mountains and forests they had lived in for 40,000 years, all of it erased so completely that we do not even have the ghost of it. What we have are bones, and increasingly, the DNA inside the bones. And from that DNA, from the haplogroups and autosomal markers and pigmentation genes and lactose intolerance variants of people who died 7,000 years ago, we can read something of the story that their civilization never got to write down. We know what they looked like. We know they were dark-skinned and often blue-eyed. We know they were lactose intolerant, unlike the farmers who replaced them. We know their immune systems were already sophisticated, that they had developed resistance to diseases we had assumed only emerged with the dense, animal contact-heavy conditions of farming life. We know they were taller and healthier than the farmers who replaced them, better nourished on their diverse hunter-gatherer diet. We know that some of their lineages survived, that the farmer populations who replaced them carried a minority of hunter-gatherer ancestry, particularly in the female line, and that this ancestry persists in modern Europeans to this day. In the Eastern Baltic, modern Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, hunter-gatherer ancestry survived in higher proportions than anywhere else in Europe, because the farming transition happened later and less completely there. In modern Scandinavians and British people, small percentages of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry can be detected. The people of 40,000 years are not entirely gone. They are a minor thread in the genetic fabric of modern Europe, present in the margins, in the corners, in the parts of the continent that the farming frontier reached last. But their world is gone. The dark-skinned, blue-eyed people who hunted deer through the birch forests and buried their dead with reindeer-tooth ornaments in Spanish mountain caves. The people who owned Europe for 40,000 years before a population explosion from Anatolia swept them away. They are the oldest story on the continent, and it is a story that history never recorded because it ended before history began. The two men in the cave in northern Spain were buried 7,000 years ago. Their DNA survived in a tooth. Scientists extracted it, sequenced it, and read it, and for a moment, across 7 millennia of silence, the original Europeans spoke. They told us they had dark skin and blue eyes. They told us they were lactose intolerant and immune to certain diseases. They told us they were related to hunters in Hungary and Luxembourg and Scandinavia, that they were part of a people who had spread across an entire continent, adapted to its ecology, and lived in it for an almost incomprehensible span of time. They did not get to tell us their names. They did not get to tell us what they called themselves, or what stories they told around their fires, or what they believed happened after death. That knowledge died with the last of them, somewhere in the shrinking forests at the edge of a farming world, in a century we cannot precisely date. The first genocide nobody remembers, recorded not in texts or monuments, but in the quiet testimony of ancient bone, and in the almost complete absence from the Y chromosomes of modern Europeans of the men who came before.